So, lesson 6, the American Revolution. What we have is a Trumbull portrait of Washington and his warhorse Nelson. Very famous warhorse. It wasn't his only warhorse, but it was his famous charger, Nelson. I'd have to look that up. This was the charger that he rode, like, even as president on his tour around the new states, no longer colonies. But we'll check that out. Yeah. All right. So, any questions about Lexington and Concord? We good there? All right. So, following the events of Lexington and Concord and the defeat of the British forces at Concord, Minutemen from in and around Boston swarmed into Boston with a total of about 20,000 militia force that outnumbered British forces led by General William Howe. I'm going to talk a little bit about Howe here shortly. Second Continental Congress will meet in Philadelphia as a result of the events of Lexington and Concord, and they decide that they're going to do a handful of things. Number one, they're going to come up with a new list of grievances known as the Olive Branch Petition. This will be formally signed and sent to George III, but it will, like the previous declarations that we've talked about, will largely be ignored by the Crown and Parliament. They adopt measures to raise money for a standing army and navy, and they will select George Washington to command the army. He'll take command at Cambridge, Massachusetts on July 3rd, 1775. You're familiar with where Cambridge is? It's right outside of Boston. Harvard, very good. Good job, guys. That's where Harvard is. So here's a lithograph of Washington taking command of the American Army, or the Continental Army, July 3rd, 1775. Why Washington? Well, he had a military command that he had led. He had served as aide-de-camp under Braddock. He rose to the rank of colonel. Remember, he couldn't go any higher because militia force couldn't raise to the rank of general. He had military training at an early age, worked as a surveyor, knew the terrain, especially Virginia. And remember, Virginia was much larger than it is today. Was one of the most skilled, if not the most skilled horsemen in colonial America. Respected by his political constituents. It wasn't a unanimous decision. It was near unanimous to select him. There was a little political jockeying going on for the command of the Continental Army. The one guy I told you about before who wanted the command was John Hancock, but Washington had the military background. He had the experience. He had, again, some military sort of allure and mythology around him as a result of his fighting and valor in the French and Indian War. So that it gained universal respect. So there were guys that respected Washington beyond just the Virginia delegation. So he's kind of like a legend in his own time, had a lot of respect from his men. And then one thing that's really going to set Washington apart, he's going to be outnumbered from the get-go. He's never going to put his army in a position to be destroyed. He'll retreat if he has to. He's all about using the strategic advantage of terrain, but also never putting the army in a position to be destroyed. He radiates patience, courage, self-discipline, a sense of justice, He insisted on working without pay. He was pretty well connected, born into a pretty prominent family. He married into an even more prominent family. He married widow Martha Dandridge Custis, who was very wealthy, and that put him into that elite planner class. But he did keep an expense account or expense report on money that had been spent out of his own pocket during the American Revolution. He intended to get the job. He showed up wearing his militia uniform, and he will gain his command officially on July 3rd. What I would like to do today is look at some significant victories for the American Patriots and some significant defeats in this first year. So let's first take a look at Bunkers Hill, Breeds Hill, and Boston. Holding the city of Boston is going to be a win-win for the Patriots. Number one, they're holding an important city, but number two, it's a moral victory because that and the mods, the Bostonians, is the root of a lot of this tension, dating all the way back to the events of the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, and the intolerable and coercive acts that had gotten them here in the first place. So, again, the first year of the Patriot cause was one where the Patriots were very loyal, and the cause was sort of concrete and just. Do keep in mind that you've got about a third of the population that's patriot, about a third of the population is loyal, and about a third of the population are either neutral, not wanting to get involved in the war, or they're like privateers. They're kind of just being bought out to the highest bidder. One problem for the Continental Army, as we mentioned in the end of lesson 5, is supply. Right? They need cannon, they need muskets, and they really need ammunition, and that is going to lead to raids on forts as far south as the Caribbean and as far north as the St. Lawrence Seaway and Appalachia. Two tremendously important forts fall into the hands of the Patriots, and there are forts that you've already learned about before. And those forts are Fort Ticonderoga and Fort Crown Point, both in present-day New York, and both were forts that we talked about in relation to the French and Indian War. These had previously been French forts, taking control by the British, and now they fell into Patriot hands. So now the Continental Army has these forts. It also makes heroes of 3 significant people, well, actually 4. Ethan and Ira Allen, the leaders of the Green Mountain Boys that are from what is present-day Vermont. Do keep in mind that Vermont was it was contested between New York and New Hampshire at this time. Vermont was never a colony. It becomes the 14th state. We'll get into that a bit later. Another guy here is Connecticut-born Benedict Arnold. He is not he's not anywhere close to becoming a traitor yet. Treason's not even on his mind at this point. How many people out there were able to attend Mr. Landis's private talk on Benedict Arnold? Cool. So we'll talk more about his treason, and we'll actually pull in Mr. Landis's some of his presentation as well. Yeah, you're good. Another guy that's important here is Artillery Commander Henry the Ox Knox. Henry the Ox Knox gained some major notoriety here because he is going to lead the oxen wagon train that pulls these cannon from Ticonderoga through Appalachia, through the Adirondacks and Appalachia to Boston to fortify the high ground in Boston. Without the ammunition and cannon coming out of these forts, the Patriots are not going to be able to or the Minutemen are not going to be able to hold Boston. And Henry the Ox Knox will go on to become the first Secretary of War. We'll talk more about the Ox Knox later. I may have also mentioned he almost rolled the boat that Washington was in on the icy Delaware, crossing to Trenton, Princeton. So we'll talk a little bit more about the Ox moving forward. So the Redcoats are going to launch a frontal assault on Breed's and Bunker's Hill in Boston. The British infantry will lead a fixed bayonet charge, much like they did at Lexington, and the Minutemen, under the command of William Prescott will famously say, "Don't fire till you see the whites of their eyes." Well, the reason that he didn't want them to fire until they could see the whites of their eyes is because he didn't want to waste ammunition or bullets because they were running low, and he wanted to make sure that if they fired on them, they weren't going to waste any bullets or waste any ammo. You might be wondering, like, this, the timeline here, maybe you put this together, you're like, wait a minute, this timeline doesn't really look appropriate for Washington to command forces at Bunker Hill and Breed's Hill. He didn't. Washington is not in command of those forces. It's going to be another famous Continental commander, Artemus Ward, will have he actually fell ill during this battle and was commanding from a sick bed during the battle, and he is faced against General Howe, the British commander. The British will evacuate Boston. The Minutemen will hold Boston. The door has been slammed shut on reconciliation, and George III and Parliament are going to move toward war. This means regular British soldiers are going to be sent over, along with British hired German Hessian mercenaries. And that mercenary group, as we mentioned before, early on was an advantage, but it becomes a disadvantage for the British as the war moves on, as many of them will desert when their contracts are up, and a lot of them end up later becoming American citizens. So, on the top left, we have this elite fighting force, the Green Mountain Boys, led by Ethan Allen. On the top right here, Artillery Commander Henry the Ox Knox. And here in the middle, Ticonderoga. Has anybody been to Ticonderoga or been to? Sweet, that's awesome. Lake Champlain, that's a spot that I intend to visit in the future. So that's some positive terrain, ground, and moral victory for the Patriots. Now, as the winter sets in, we're going to look at some pretty rough defeats for the Americans moving into 1776, and that is what I would call the Canadian quagmire, meaning that the Patriots believed they were going to be able to march into Quebec and Montreal, and the French Canadians would take up arms and fight alongside them. Why would that probably not be the case? Okay, right? They don't really have a whole lot of love lost for them. They had fought against them in the French and Indian War. Good job. How about the fact that they just had a favorable act passed on their behalf? Remember we talked about the Quebec Act that allowed them to get back and settle the Ohio River Valley. So this is kind of like one of those rock in a hard place, damned if you do, damned if you don't scenarios again, where it's like, do we just stay on the course with the British here and allow them to do their thing and have a working relationship? Or do we turn against them, take up arms with these colonists, and try to fight in these cities that are fortified by the British and have a large British troop presence? So this is a sort of a dangerous game that the colonists want the French Canadians to enter into. Another part of this too is there is a major religious difference. The French Canadians are mostly Catholic, and most of the colonists are anti-Catholic. So you got a lot of factors that are working against the colonists in this particular seizure of cities. So it turns out the raid on Quebec and the raid on Montreal completely fall apart. The two commanding officers, who were giant officers in this era, one's going to be wounded, Benedict Arnold, and should have had his leg amputated. And if you remember Mr. Landis's lecture, he talked about how there's one monument to Benedict Arnold, and that is a boot, right? So we'll talk a little bit more about Arnold's boot. So Arnold did not have the leg amputated, but then Montgomery, Richard Montgomery is killed in this battle. This is a real big turning point, okay, on the side of the British. Losing Richard Montgomery was very difficult for the Continental Army early on, all right? How many people do I have any Hokies out there? Anybody been to Blacksburg in their life? Yeah, probably. All right. So you might be familiar with the county, Montgomery County. It's named for Richard Montgomery. All right. So he is, again, he was a prominent general, right? And to lose that prominent of a general early on in the war was pretty devastating. So, what's up? Yeah, go for it. All right, so Montgomery's gains are lost. The St. Lawrence Seaway is lost to the colonists. In the next month, January, the British set fire to Norfolk, and there is going to be a moral victory that the Patriots will have in North Carolina at Morris Creek Bridge. They'll defeat Loyalists there, and they will prevent temporarily a British fleet invasion of Charleston Harbor in South Carolina in 1776. So here we have Richard Montgomery on the left, Benedict Arnold on the right. Okay, moving on, let's talk a little bit about Thomas Paine's common sense. Thomas Paine is what I would call, much like Sam Adams, a professional malcontent. He's not happy, right? Unless he's stirring things up. Now, what you need to understand is Thomas Paine is British. He is born in England. He had been protesting the taxes that had been passed in England as a result of the French and Indian War, right? He was inspired by the Enlightenment. He was inspired by philosophers like Hobbes and Locke. He is going to produce common sense under the pseudonym Plain Truth. There are some individuals that have influence on Thomas Paine, besides the Enlightenment philosophers. There are two contemporaries in particular. Benjamin Franklin, who pretty much secures Paine's passage to Philadelphia, and Benjamin Rush, who is going to point Paine in the direction of publisher Robert Bell. Bell will publish Common Sense. Now, the idea in the first publication was that if they made enough money, they were going to donate money to the soldiers under Montgomery and Arnold's command, because, as you can imagine, it was pretty daggone cold up in this military campaign that was being fought in St. Lawrence, right? I don't know if anybody's spent any time in or around Canada in the winter months, but it's no joke, all right? The temperatures are freezing. So a lot of those soldiers were faced with not only a lack of supply, but they were also faced with exposure to elements. So what do I mean by exposure? Yeah, they were disease, and then the one dreaded thing that you don't want to get in the cold, frostbite, right? So guys are losing their fingers, toes, and they've fallen ill. Turns out they actually don't really make any money off of Common Sense. And I think for a very long period of time, historians have tried to put their finger on, is this a Robert Bell problem? Were the funds, sort of like embezzled, that like what was made off the pamphlet? Some historians would say it wasn't necessarily that, it was the fact that the pamphlet was widely sold, but even 120,000 copies being sold in 1776 didn't put it in a position to be like, even though in our minds it's a bestseller, it's a bestseller sort of like, you know, it wasn't selling more copies than the Bible. It wasn't selling more copies than Poor Richard's Almanac or anything like that. But what it did was it had a really tremendous effect or impact on not only the Patriots, but the Continental Army as well. In fact, George Washington had the pamphlet read to those members of the Continental Army that were illiterate and couldn't read. So in this, basically what Paine's going to talk about is how, you know, this is absurd that a larger nation or continent, and it's not obviously America the way we think of it in our minds, but a larger expanse of land being ruled by an island is absurd. And that George III, the royal brute of Great Britain, had deprived the colonies of their rights. And Connor had a copy of Common Sense a couple weeks ago. We were looking at that. That symbol was the symbol for the pound, not the lira. That was my fault. I went back and looked at it for you. Just wanted to like shore that up with you. But you know, he's like talking about grievances on everything from expenses of the French and Indian War to all of the acts that had been passed, like the Sugar Act, Stamp Act, Tea Act, Quartering Act, Townshend Act. He lays all those out in Common Sense. All right? So when you're thinking of Thomas Paine and you're thinking of Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, these people are contemporaries. In fact, he was a little bit jaded. He felt like he was kind of like left out of the revolutionary circle. And that his pamphlet had inspired the revolutionary circle to move forward, and it most certainly inspired the Declaration of Independence, because we're going to be able to make those connections today as well. An interesting motivator and inspiration to both Paine and Jefferson is going to be John Locke. John Locke, you guys remember learning about the two treaties of government last year? Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about that. So Paine argued and urged the idea that there should be a republic where representative senators, governors, and judges would have their power from the consent of the governed. He also intertwined biblical imagery. So he's inspired by the Enlightenment, but what movement is he trying to jump off of? Very good. Excellent job. The First Great Awakening. Okay? So a lot of the ideas that Paine lays out in this pamphlet, do keep in mind that the pamphlet was being published as like separate segments in the Philadelphia newspaper, but it just got to the point where it was so big that it just was all published together at once in January of 1776. A lot of these ideas had been expressed in Locke's two treaties of government. Paine's ideas about rejecting the monarchy, embracing independence, but he's also trying to sort of point out like New Englanders, Virginians, they inherently are different because they are republics by nature. Okay? This is exactly what Paine is talking about, what Locke was talking about in the 1780s, right? The movement toward republicanism. All right, so here's John Locke, who inspired both Paine and Jefferson. And there's the two treaties of government, published in the late 1600s. So keep in mind that Locke is not a contemporary. Locke is an inspiration. He's an Enlightenment philosopher. Okay? And he's inspired by the events of things like the English Civil War. So let's take a look at a handful of these theories from two treaties of government. All people are free, equal, and have natural rights of life, liberty, and property that rulers cannot take away. Why would property be a big deal to protect in England? There's not a lot of it. Very good. And it's mostly controlled by the crown and nobles. Very good. Nice work. All original power resides in the people. They consent to enter into a social contract. Social contract. Among themselves to form a government to protect their rights. In return, the people promise to obey the laws and rules established by their government, establishing a system of ordered liberty. Guys, this is one of the most basic and simple concepts to understand because we live this day in and day out. Every other day I see you, we have a social contract. You come in, I educate you, right? I have expectations of you, you follow through with those expectations, and we have a system of ordered liberty. So suppose that I decide I'm not going to teach you anymore, but you're going to just get your college credit for doing absolutely nothing. Some of you might be excited. I would guarantee most of you wouldn't because you actually do crave structure, right? We want structure in some fashion. Some of you might get to the point where you said, you know what? I'm going to talk to somebody about this. I'm going to go talk to the dean, or I'm going to go talk to, a high-ranking official. So Mr. E gets what? Fired. So I get fired, right? To alter or abolish me, to overthrow me, right? I appreciate that. I don't want to lose my job. That's why I am deeply passionate about not only helping you guys out, but I'm also passionate about upholding our social contract. How do I make my money? Right. But where does my money come from? Tax dollars, right? So that adds to our social contract. So we take it a step further. I'm following through the social contract. All is well. And I say, Harrison, do you mind putting up your phone? Thank you. That's ordered liberty. It's not a big deal. But let's say I took Harrison's phone and slammed it into the ground. and just spiked it.
I have an example of that.
Okay, hold on. So, no, I don't care if your phone's up. I honestly don't. This is just an example. That's ordered liberty, right? The fact that I could care less that his phone's out charging right now. But if I said, hey, would you mind putting that away, and he just put it away, that's our ordered liberty. I'm not going to waste my time on, quibbling over a phone being out right now, because that's the ordered liberty that we have in this room. But if I slammed his phone into the ground, and people might not respect that, and that might not only impact our ordered liberty, but it also might impact our social contract, right? Does that make sense though? You guys, is that a relevant connection? All right, I like it. All right, so I just wanted to kind of bring that in because I think these are like connections that we can make on a daily basis. All right, I do want you to keep in mind. So like government's powers are limited to those the people have consented to give it. Whenever the government becomes destructive or a threat to the people's natural rights, they break the social contract and the people can alter or abolish it. So that's the idea that we see this idea, we're going to see it again momentarily. Do keep in mind, Thomas Hobbes brought forth the social contract before Locke. Did you guys read any segments out of Leviathan last year? Okay? Yes. All right. So Leviathan both Leviathan and the two treaties of government are political works inspired, political philosophy inspired not only by the English Civil War, but also inspired as a result of what will become the Enlightenment. All right, so let's take a look at Leviathan, just a segment. The lives of individuals in the state of nature are solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, in short, a state in which self-interest and absence of rights and contracts prevented the social or society. So what Leviathan is, it is a more conservative idea on the social contract, or conservative theory on the social contract, whereas Locke is more of a liberal perspective on the social contract. So it's kind of cool to like dig back into this political theory and see how it impacted the founding of our nation, but it's also kind of cool to look at this political theory and see how it impacts us today. So let's take a look at Jefferson and that impact that Hobbes, Locke, and Paine have on Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. Sure. So members of the Second Continental Congress met in May and June of 1776. Richard Henry Lee of Virginia is the first guy to sort of promote a Declaration of Independence. No one really wanted to take up the job of writing it. So the guy that, it's sort of again almost a near unanimous decision that was appointed to do this was Thomas Jefferson. They actually decided to make it a committee of 5. Jefferson, Adams, not Sam, John Adams, Ben Franklin, Roger Sherman of Connecticut, and Robert Livingston of New York. What you have here is you have 5 prominent people from 5 different former colonies, what will become states here in the near future. This is America's and one of the world's greatest breakup letters. All right? I don't know if you've ever written or received a breakup letter. I think that they've probably fallen out of vogue. I don't know if anybody probably like breakup ever text. It's pretty cold-blooded, but you know, take time to like, you know, break out the quill and ink. Very, you know, sort of nostalgic to write the breakup letter in the style of the Declaration of Independence. Yeah, Jalen, what's up? Well, here's what I was going to say though. Normally in a breakup letter it might be like, hey, it's not you, it's me. Whereas Thomas Jefferson's like, it's you, it's not us, you know? So here's what we're gonna take a look at, how the 2 treaties of government and how common sense impacts the Declaration. Independence Day was supposed to be July 2nd. They decided to revise it, made a lot of people angry, so they ended up signing it on July 4th, and what you need to realize is it takes a while for the delegates all to get it signed. They're either like ducking in and out of Philadelphia signing it, or it's getting passed around because they were all, for the most, not all, but for the most part, most of them were there on the 2nd for the signing, but most everybody was gone by the 4th. Here is a painting of Jefferson at Jefferson's apartment in Philadelphia with Franklin and Adams drafting the Declaration. So, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That is inspiration from Locke's 2 treaties of government. And to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the government. Again, 2 treaties of government. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and to institute new government. This all goes back to the social contract ordered liberty theory. Here's a copy of the Declaration of Independence, John Hancock, and the signatures from the other delegates. Remember, John Hancock is the president of the Second Continental Congress. Let's take a look at the grievances that had been previously laid out in common sense, or at least some of them. For quartering large bodies of armed troops among us, Quartering Act. For protecting them by mock trial from punishment for any murders which they should commit on the inhabitants of these states, Boston Massacre. For suspending our own legislatures, House of Burgesses was disbanded by Lord John Murray Dunmore, and they become the Virginia General Assembly. For cutting off our trade with all parts of the world, passage of the navigation laws and enforcing them. For imposing taxes on us without our consent, Stamp Act, Sugar Act, Townshend Act, Tea Act. For transporting us beyond seas to be tried for pretended offenses. What group put Ben Franklin on trial? What council? Privy Council. Very good. Well done. Good job. And here we have the Trumbull painting of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, which is a pretty ironic and iconic painting. It's on the back of the $2 bill. It's very much Americana, but it very much did not occur that way. That is not how things looked on July 4th, because everybody was gone by the time the Declaration was signed. Questions? Great job, guys. Well done today.